Welcome to Still Plays Galaxy of Heroes. We're back with a list video on the squads to not be putting on defense. The way to be thinking about this list is like clothes or shoes. You're going to grow out of them. It's completely appropriate to be using these teams at various points in the game, but as your roster matures, the relevancy of these teams is going to expire, and you're either going to stop using them or you're going to transition them into offense. Problem is not whether or not you use one of these teams on occasion or even regularly. The issue is when you start using several of these squads on defense. That's a sign your roster needs to get deeper. I've talked a lot about roster depth on this channel. I'll put a card up in the corner and thumbnails on the end for alternate squads you can be developing to build out your roster depth and why going after Gear 11 is a very effective way for building out that roster depth. But for the purposes of this video, relics don't always mean it's a better team. Relics without synergy can perform worse than lower gear characters with synergy. And this is stuff we'll probably tackle in future videos, a future methods video. But here's the TLDR overview of a Grand Arena defensive strategy. Don't put filler squads on defense. Squads that may not even be synergistic that you're throwing in to fill the requirements. Avoid freebie squads. These are easily counterable high banner squads. Don't set those. Don't put soloable defensive down. I'm surprised how often I see those. What you need to be trying to achieve are getting holds, forcing your opponent into difficult choices, challenging their depth by stretching their counters by using teams that use redundant counters, and then trying to steal as many banners as possible if the team isn't going to get a hold. The new matchmaking that came with Grand Arena 2.0 challenges rosters to be deeper and wider sooner than they did in the past. Matchmaking being tied to skill rating means players are jumping around between leagues and divisions, needing to set more teams on defense than they had when they had the slower progression of the matchmaking when it was tied to overall GP. And that's the wider purpose of this video, is to highlight when you need to be prioritizing building out that roster depth, which is a topic we've talked a lot about on this channel, about the benefits of deeper and wider rosters. And what I want to do with this video is identify the warning signs of when you need to make those changes. So make sure you are looking at your Grand Arena history if you already aren't on SWGOH.gg. Look at those results. See which defensive teams are losing and what kind of teams they're losing to. And now we're going to take a look at this list in the rough order of how these teams should be expiring in their utility. I know this doesn't apply to anybody who's watching this channel, and it really only applies to the newest of accounts, but this is the I can't believe I have to say this tier. That's don't put down any junk teams that have no synergy, that are just throwing a bunch of characters together. And don't put down teams that have super light synergy that you happen to have because you were working on the journey guide. In this case, I'm just showing the CLS event requirement characters as an example. The first of the real examples, Rogue One. This team's a little less common now that Mon Mothma has been cannibalizing some of these characters, but on the alt, I will see this team on new accounts because Territory Battles has incentivized some players to build Rogue One squads. But this is a squad that can be soloed by Wampa. It should not be put down on defense. It's easy banners for your opponent. Phoenix, probably the team everyone thought I was going to put at the bottom of this list, but there's enough synergy here where they are a nuisance early on. And with new accounts, with how scarce credits and purple ability mats are, you can't actually build that many teams. And so I was forced into using Phoenix for the first 1 to 3 seasons of Grand Arena until I was able to build out additional squads. That's really the only context in which I would recommend or see using them, but you do want to grow out of this team as quickly as possible. But surprisingly, I do see this team in my main account, which is a 7 million GP account. I still see Phoenix on defense, and that's a mistake because unless they have all the Zetas or some key Zetas, Wampa can solo these guys. And you should not be setting down a team that is soloable by one character. And if you can stop a Wampa solo, I hope your count is far more developed than mine is. Next up, the Ewoks. This team has some shades of the Phoenix, where there is a period of time when this team is appropriate. They can be a bit of a nuisance with their turn meter gain and their speed, but you should be trying to move on from them as early as you can. This is a team that I built out quickly because I went after CLS and that Chupio squad as quickly as possible. That's one of my recommendations for the first journey character you should be getting. And because of that, I had a solid enough Ewoks team for a long period. But as soon as you can, you should be trying to find a replacement, because that window of opportunity does close by the time you hit 2 million GP. Problem later on, though, is this team is an easy solo for Nest. Even if you put the Omicron on Chirpa, which a surprising amount of people have, this team just gets crushed by troopers. It's not worthy of a defensive slot. If you do put the Omicron on, then I would be considering it for offensive usage, not defensive usage. And now for the Old Republic. This is the team why this entire video exists. I wanted to rant about this. This team should never be put on defense. I get why people do it. You need to have a bunch of gear and resources on them to get Malak, but that doesn't make them worthy of being put on defense. And because of how shallow a lot of rosters are, a lot of players feel forced into setting this team down, which is why when the Grand Arena matchmaking changed a year ago, when they changed the GP thresholds and added a bunch of defensive slots, I've been saying ever since then every player should be trying to prioritize getting the Kylo Ren Relic so that you could solo this squad. Because they were going to become so much more common and so much harder for people to replace. They are not a team that anyone should be setting down on defense or really using at this point. These guys are countered by way too many teams. Even in my alt account that's only like 2.2 million GP, I don't have a use for these guys except for offensive depth. I have enough defensive squads to be setting down where I don't need to be worrying about utilizing these guys. And now the Night Sisters, a team I'm sad to put on this list because I love the Night Sisters. They are one of the squads I recommend most for low investment, quick roster depth. But on defense these days, they are far too easily countered, and I surprisingly see them very often. But they are too important for offense to be put on defense. So they're a team that are not worthy enough of a defensive slot and far too important in an offensive slot to be setting down on defense. This next tier is a set of 4. They're all a derivation on the same idea. These are the Galactic Legend prerequisite squads. These are the bridge squads that you build out as you're working towards a better character, where you end up having a bunch of relics on characters that aren't really any good. There's a false idea that relics make characters better, and they don't. A lot of these squads can be soloed, like this Phasma team, that's a Nest solo. This Resistance team, that's a Nest solo. Rebels can be undersized, probably soloed by Nest. I probably have tried it before. The Sith squad, like all of these teams are not worthy of a defensive slot. They're usually high banner wins in most cases. Night Sisters, for one, are a team that can handle every one of these. So I don't want to talk about any of these squads anymore. The only problem they offer me is me trying to figure out what is the weakest team I can use to beat them. I'm disappointed every time I see them on defense. Let's talk about the next team. They are far more worthy of the discussion. The Geonosians, they are probably the most important defensive squad in the early game. And for a very long time, they're going to be very effective because your opponent either is going to have a counter or they don't. And they're going to shut opponents down. But at a certain GP threshold, your opponents are going to understand how to beat this team. And they, at that point, are not going to be worthy of the slot because they can be far too easily countered by way too many teams, even undersized with higher banners. I do want to put a caveat with them, though, because after a year of them probably never seeing defense in my Grand Arenas, I have put them down on defense a couple times lately because of one of those rules I mentioned earlier in the video. What Geonosians do is they force my opponent to make choices by stretching their counters and challenging their roster depth, because what we have these days is a lot of redundant counters. Treya is now challenged with Mon Mothma, Geonosians, and Dash Rendar. My opponent is going to have enough teams in order to throw at multiple teams. So that this only becomes a viable defensive squad again if you have enough solid defensive teams. If you don't have that many solid defensive teams, they're not going to be forced into making that choice, and Geonosians are not worthy of being put on defense. This next set here, Bossk and Kylo Ren, they're paired together because they function similarly, where unless you have them at high relics, they shouldn't be set on defense. Below high relics, they're easily managed, and I actually like Jango lead better, or I like Hux lead better. But at high relics, they can become a problem, and the amount of counters shrinks. My Bossk team, without the Zam Omicron, has tripped up a number of opponents now that I have them at the requirements for the Executor. Those Executor level Bossk teams will trip up opponents. Same with Kylo Ren. Those JTR teams need to be of a certain level in order to count. Actually, both these teams, both Kylo and Bossk. Weaker JTR teams are going to be tripped up by them. And it is an effective way to get some holds, is people underestimating these teams at high relics. But if they are not at high relics, don't put them on defense. They are easily countered at lower levels. This is a team I call Bad Mothma. So Bad Mothma is a poorly constructed Mon Mothma team, usually with a bunch of relics on it, because this is also a derivation of those Galactic Legend bridge teams. But these characters have few or minimal synergy. I would recommend you put the Pow Hoth Rebel Scout versions or the Kyle Katarn or Cara Dune characters in with this squad. Even if you have them at Gear 11, the synergies there are far more problematic than putting these Relic characters on with Mon Mothma. They're not an effective defensive squad at those levels, and they're only going to trip people up if they do dumb things like I do of trying to solo them because they disrespect them too much. We're going to get out of here on this one. This is a quick look back on the list as a whole, covering the characters that you shouldn't be setting on defense or should be trying to grow out of as quickly as possible, build out that roster depth, and move on from. I know I was largely speaking to the choir on this one, so thank you for taking the time to watch this video. Here are the thumbnails I was referring to earlier in the video about cheap squads that you can build out and my larger philosophies about roster development. Be safe out there, everyone, and be excellent to each other. This is Still Plays Galaxy of Heroes.